This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
But it's sort of related to the other most surprising but yet not surprising thing, is that Cormac McCarthy dropped LSD. Now, how do we know this? I mean, I guess we don't know this as for a fact, but we're going to take the word of somebody else. The writer Gary Wallace in 1992 published an article in Southern Quarterly about some time that he spent with McCarthy in 1989 in El Paso when McCarthy was helping their mutual friend, the gambler Betty Carey, write a memoir. And apparently he wasn't really helping her with it that much, but they would kind of talk about her memoir at times. So let me just read this bit. And I'm kind of sticking this. It's kind of out of order. This is the thing. When did he drop LSD? We don't know, other than he says he did it before it was made illegal. So sometime before 1968. Was it during the San Francisco time? It's a little on the early side in the history of LSD for him to have been doing it, but could have been any time during the 60s. But here we go. Here's from this article in 1992 issue of Southern Quarterly by Gary Wallace. Quote, back at his motel room, Frank related a number of personal religious experiences that he had had over the years, pointing out the flaws in other people's lack of faith. I challenged him, saying that one day science would understand these unexplained phenomena for what they really were. McCarthy commented that some cultures used drugs to enhance the spiritual experience and that he had tried LSD before the drug was made illegal. He said that it had helped to open his eyes to these kinds of experiences. Betty recounted having seen the image of Christ on a bus while in Costa Rica. This had been at a time following the casino scam when Betty had been on the run. She said that her experience was as real as our sitting together in the motel room. It had not been a dream or hallucination. Always the skeptic, I said, but how does that prove Christianity? Why not Buddha or Allah? You saw Jesus because you were raised in Jesus land. I looked to Frank and McCarthy. Their expressions were sympathetic. McCarthy was slumped into one of the chairs with his left leg slung over the armrest. He appeared a very patient listener. He said that he felt sorry for me because I was unable to grasp this concept of spiritual experience. He said that people all over the world and every religion were familiar with this experience. He asked if I'd ever read William James's The Variety of Religious Experience. I had not. His attitude seemed to indicate that in this book were the answers to many of the questions posed during our evening discussion. I was nonplussed. Truth, McCarthy said about what writers must accomplish in their writing. But what exactly is truth, I asked. Truth, he repeated, his implications tacit. So, interesting little hang with Cormac McCarthy. And one does have to wonder what was the context of dropping acid. Clearly left some kind of mark on him, and sort of opened his mind in some degree, some way or another. But maybe he didn't need any help. Yeah.
Also explains there's a scene in Suttree toward the end where he eats psychedelic mushrooms and has these elaborate trips. I have to think that was informed by Cormac's experience with the CIA's special potion.
Right. Yeah. Well, what if I think Cormac got MK Ultra'd?
Nah, too strong.
Bounced right off of him.
Yeah, just some DJ.
Yeah,
no. No. You could tell the guy that read Blood Meridian tripped. I think. I don't think.
I mean,
it's
not a huge surprise.
Right.
Yeah. That wrote Blood Meridian.
I think that tracks.
Tracks. Yeah.
Now, after this time in San Francisco, he takes a second stab at University of Tennessee, where he ends up getting his first pieces of writing out there, other than Autumn's Magic as a schoolboy. These are two short stories, Awake for Susan and A Drowning Incident. These would be the only short stories he ever wrote. Well, that we know about, and there might be some others in the archive, but he basically just wrote novels and screenplays and plays. but he gets these two stories published in the University of Tennessee Journal under the name C.J. McCarthy, and wins a college writing award and a little bit of money. But he does not stay at University of Tennessee for very long. In 1959, he drops out again. So what is next? 1959, the same year he drops out of University of Tennessee for the second and final time. He's 26 years old. He starts The Orchard Keeper, although that title wouldn't be applied until the very end. On May 3rd of 1962, this book lands in the slush pile of Random House. And up from this pile, through a kind of a circuitous route, which is described in detail in Diane C. Luce's book, Embracing Vocation, it ends up in the hands of Albert Erskine, who was an editor of another fella by the name of William Faulkner. This is in 1962. This book lands on, and Faulkner had been dead for a couple of months. When did Faulkner die?
60, I believe 62.
62, yeah. So I think it was just a couple months later after Faulkner has passed away. The Orchard Keeper lands on Faulkner's editor's desk. And there is, despite there's a lot of Faulkner influence in McCarthy. I think some people have, in some critical or some reviews over time, have sort of said it's too much like Faulkner. I think that's kind of misplaced or misunderstanding what Cormac is up to. But nonetheless,
that's like too much of tasty, delicious cake.
Right. Exactly.
Take it away. There's too, yeah.
You put too much bacon on my plate. What the
it's
hell?
just too much incredibly tasty bacon. We know what they mean. Okay, you can see the lineage there, but no, he has his own voice and is his own man.
Sure.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Now, after it lands on Albert Erskine's desk, it wouldn't actually be published for 3 more years. That's a long time.
It's a long turnaround.
Yeah. Now, if you want to get a sense of the saga, not only do we get in Diane C. Luce's Embracing Vocation, not only do you get the story of like it showing up on Albert Erskine's desk, but you also get the saga of editing it, because at this time, Cormac was he was pretty confident in his powers, but he also, he was in a position where he was trying to get published. He wanted to be in Random House. He's got this editor, and this editor makes some suggestions, and he takes them. Later in his career, nobody could tell Cormac McCarthy anything. But early on, there was a little bit of like, oh yeah, Al, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll consider that. Yeah, that's a thank you. Yeah. And it, and probably for good reason. You have to think Cormac didn't go through any of the channels that we are now familiar with as a writer's, there was no apprenticeship. His apprenticeship was working on a nearly complete manuscript with one of the great literary editors of all time. That was his
Amazing.
apprenticeship. Yeah, he skipped a lot of steps, and good for him. Now, just a little bit on Albert Erskine. As we said, William Faulkner's editor, also Eudora Welty's, I believe, and maybe Willa Cather's. He was a guy who was the editor of James Michener, friend of the pod. He was briefly married to
Papa Mitch, Daddy Mitch.
He was our
patron. He was our first subscriber, our first patron. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Albert Erskine was briefly married to Catherine Ann Porter. He had ended up at Random House instead of his previous publisher because he'd fallen out over his old boss over the merits of Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. Erskine liked it, and whatever the boss of the previous publishing company did not.
That is going on the book club list for sure. We have to do Lowry. We have to do Under the Volcano.
Cool. Yeah.
And I think now we have to maybe do Sutri too. I'm pronouncing it like they do. Yeah, Sutri. Yeah. But Sutri, no, Under the Volcano, banger.
Yeah, absolutely. About Albert Erskine, William Faulkner had this to say, quote, "Albert is the best book editor I know. But he wouldn't tell Erskine this because, quote, when I've got a horse that's running good, I don't stop to give him some sugar. Yeah. Now, Erskine was pretty. Erskine understood that he had a powerful young writer on his hands, even though, McCarthy's fairly young. He's in his early 30s. Or actually, he's 29 when I guess when the book shows up on Erskine's desk. Um, um, he knew also, and Erskine, you get the sense that he's very sophisticated, and he probably tailored his approach to each individual writer. I can only imagine being an editor where professionally, where this is your entire career, is turning the work of these very talented people into something great or something better than it started out as. That it's a bit like herding cats. You got to be careful about people's personalities. You got to make sure to give their ego. Everybody's ego needs a very calibrated amount of massaging. but some people, if you do it too much, they're gonna resent it, right? So you have to tailor your approach to everybody.
Longtime listeners of the show will know that I am handling Brad Kelly this way from day one.
He's done a good job. It's been seamless.
I am technically the show's editor. I am technically the person who presses publish.
That's right. That's true. That's true.
I don't edit anything.
It's going to be your biography one day, Handling Brad Kelly by Kevin.
Yes.
And then,
Very good.
100 years ago, people speculate, what did they mean by handling? What did that mean?
Just handling Bad Kelly. Right. Okay, very good. That's my Goodwill Hunting.
Let me see. Let me read you a little bit from Embracing Vocation about this thing with Albert Erskine. If I can get my Kobo to cooperate with me. It's been really slow turning pages all of a sudden for some reason. I don't know if I spilled a coffee on it or what.
You have some special device. You mentioned this on a previous episode.
I do. Yeah, it's basically a Kindle. But you can do a little bit more with it than you can with a Kindle.
I'll allow it.
Yeah, I mean, we read a lot of stuff, and sometimes I can get PDFs of things for this show, and I don't have to buy a book,
We do read an awful lot. Libris loves when we put an order in.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
I need a bigger house.
I know. I'm always buying a stack about yay big. It's like,
I know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I know. Woe is me. I have to buy books.
Oh, come on. I wanted to get this page. I might have to just skip it. Let me just skip it. The Orchard Keeper.
You can always come back to it on the After Dark.
Yeah. The Orchard Keeper would come out in 1965 to largely positive reviews, but fairly small sales. They sold 3,000 some odd copies in the first run. And I just found it interesting. Unfortunately, I don't have much insight into the publishing industry now, but I do find it very interesting that Erskine was willing to spend all of this time on this young writer. They sell 3,000 copies, and Erskine's like, "Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a good first start. Yep. All right, let's get to work on the next one." And I think that's an interesting the fact that Erskine, the faith that he had in young.
Do you
Cormac
think
McCarthy.
Erskine from jump knew that he was cultivating the next? He knew.
100%.
He's like, you're going to be folk. Okay, gotcha.
He's like, this is this generation.
This is our guy. This is our guy. This is the guy.
Yeah.
Damn.
It makes sense. Like Faulkner just died.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to fill their shoes? In comes this manuscript by a Southern unknown young man writing in that vein, and he's like, hell yeah.
And this was also a time, I don't know the exact timeline of the like the whole Robert Penn Warren, John Crow Ransom, like I'm not sure. Cormac comes a little bit after those, but it's sort of the tail end of that whole thing.
Right.
And so it was, being a writer from the South was like, people would raise their eyebrow and say, "Oh, is this the next, Eudora Welty? Is this the next Flannery O'Connor?"
Right.
It was enough to get you some attention. The book did win the Faulkner Prize in 1966 for a debut novel, so that's also very nice. But what else is going on in his life? He started Orchard Keeper in 1959. It doesn't get published till 1965. There's other stuff going on in those 6 years. Here's a little bit of that. He gets married for the first time to a woman named Lee Holloman. She's 22, he's 28. In 1960, they spend 1960-61, they spend some time in Chicago shortly after getting married. He gets a part-time job working for an auto parts place. Apparently, he works there for a year, which is the longest he ever held a single position, except maybe the disc jockey job. She gets a job as a clerk slash typist, and they apparently supplemented their income with welfare, according to Cormac McCarthy's letters. Excuse me. During this time, per Diane C. Luce, he is inspired toward a story about a guy in New Orleans by a poem he'd read by Louis Deal about a NOLA jazz clarinetist, suggesting that he has been, the germ of The Passenger started maybe 60 years before that book was finalized. 1962, near the start of Lee's pregnancy, they pack up in Chicago and they go back to Tennessee and they live with Cormac's parents for a while. As Cormac's second wife, Anne Delisle, would say, Cormac's imagine his dad became a powerful lawyer, right? Clearly a smart guy. I mean, top 5% of Yale. The Ivies maybe aren't what they used to be, but if you're in the top 5% of Yale, you're something.
You know how to take a test anyway.
Yeah.
You're no slouch.
Right, exactly.
Let's be real.
Yeah. Right. So, he's a very analytical man, very pragmatic guy, and he, quote, according to Anne Delisle, quote, didn't know what to make of him, which I don't think should be a surprise at all. And obviously this sort of chosen career, they had two older children, both of whom were progressing through life very nicely, right? Two older sisters. And then you've got this son who's he went to the Air Force. I guess that's good. Now he's back, and then he dropped out of college. Now he moved to Chicago for who knows what reason. He's got a part-time job at an auto parts store, and he's writing a novel. Like what? Very few fathers in all of history have been excited about this path thus far. Right. So you can imagine living with Cormac and his young pregnant wife, living with his parents. That wasn't going to go very well. So what do? They pretty much move into a shack on a pig farm in Sevier County. In November of 1962, Cullen McCarthy is born. This is Cormac McCarthy's first son. And by that winter of 1962, Lee, who is a writer in her own right, is already in her poetry, quote, declaring her freedom. And by July of the following year, she has moved out into a hotel. Seems like she lived with Cormac's mother for a little while. And then eventually, they are divorced. Years later, in the obituary she wrote for herself, she died in 2009. So she was writing this, somewhat shortly before that. She claimed that basically they'd gotten divorced because despite the fact that she was doing most of the household chores and taking care of Cullen, apparently, according to her, Cormac had asked her to get a job so that he could persist at writing while they're living in a shack on a pig farm.
There have been casualties.
That's right.
There is collateral damage sometimes in the pursuit of greatness.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for every Cormac, there are 100,000 guys like him who do similar things and maybe don't make it too. It's a risk. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
These are.
Yeah, this is the first instance in the life of Cormac that we get what a friend on Twitter, Sharon Adario, calls the art monster. And basically what this is it doesn't have anything to do with the quality of their work or anything. It's what an obsessional dedication to it does to everyone around you, right? Because you start in subtle ways taking advantage of people. And, it takes a lot of time, like literal time out of the day to write a good novel. And the people around you don't always give you that time. And so sometimes how people go about getting that time is by being total assholes. And I have been guilty of this I think Cormac was probably guilty of it. I think a lot of people are guilty of it at one time or another. And you might just lead you to tell your 23-year-old wife with a new baby that she needs to get a job so you can keep writing. Not because you have an awesome job, but it's not quite enough money. And like, hey, we need a little bit of a, but so I can keep writing my novel. Um, it's tough. It's it's a big ask, right? So middle of 1963, Cormac and Lee are divorced. She heads off to Wyoming after a brief stay with Cormac's mother. And it would appear that at this time, Cormac is already deep into Outer Dark. Aaron, what is Outer Dark?
So, Outer Dark is the pleasant story of a brother and sister who have had sex and have a child together in the opening pages. Home and his sister Renthi. And then, I don't think there's any kind of spoiler, very early on in the book, Culla takes the infant out into the woods and abandons it. The Outer Dark takes place around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, right? Unspecified Appalachia, seems to be Eastern Tennessee. And at that point, as near as I can tell, as Culla is coming back to the cabin, he crosses into hell. Now, hell looks like Appalachia still, but a number of supernatural things begin to happen. The river runs backwards, and so there are all these various allusions to both the Hades and the hell of Christian theology, and three furies are unleashed on the landscape. They're very, very much hillbilly furies, but they just are in constant movement and kind of murdering people as they go, which is Cormac's his first playing around with the constantly moving, unkillable killers.
Indeed.
A la Judge Holden, Anton Chigurh, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And it is I mean, I guess it's only his second novel, but it is certainly there's all kinds of interesting things he does in it to sort of bring it into what we would call, I guess in general, it's not a realistic work, right? And as you said, the Furies, it's mentioned in some of the scholarly stuff, they call it the Triune. There's also, there was an interesting bit when they were in the editing process. He sent it to Albert Erskine, and there's some things in it that chronologically don't quite make sense. And that was one of the things that Albert Erskine first wanted to fix, right? He's like, this, you have this happening and then this happening, and that couldn't have quite worked out that way. It was a bunch of, kind of standard editorial stuff. And Cormac, basically, they did make some improvements in that regard, but he basically made the point that one thing he was doing to make it not realistic was he was screwing with time. He was making it so that subtly, as a reader, at some level, you're catching these little incongruities in how time is passing. And that in and of itself, no matter what is actually happening on the page, that in and of itself is making it feel kind of dreamlike. And I just thought that was an interesting, it's an interesting conceit creatively, but it's also kind of like Erskine sort of didn't get it, and Cormac had to kind of persuade him. And I just found that to be, and I think Cormac was right. I think it makes sense for this piece. You wouldn't necessarily do that in every book, but it works here.
That's the best of his early books before Century.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Let's see. So after he gets divorced, Lee has divorced him and moved to Wyoming. And Cormac McCarthy is a writer out on his own recognizance, right? And I guess, Kevin said there have been casualties. Um, Cormac didn't really have much to do with Cullen for a long time. Um, and some point, somebody later in his career, when he'd had some success, somebody asked him if he had been paying like child support or alimony, and he said, "With what? What was I going to pay them?
Right.
What was I going to pay it with? I didn't have any money, right?"
Catfish and beans. Catfish and
Right,
beans.
right, right, right.
Yeah.
Um, Through 1964, he would live alternately in Asheville, Tennessee, in Asheville, North Carolina, and in Tennessee. And in November of 1964, he would move to New Orleans. He would actually, for a while, live just a short walk from Faulkner's one-time residence. And I looked up the address of this. If anybody's been in New Orleans and been to Lafitte's, now Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop Bar, it's like the oldest continuously operating bar in the United States, supposedly. Cormac McCarthy lived like behind it almost. He was about 50 feet away from this bar. And at the time in the mid 60s, it was a hub of countercultural stuff in New Orleans. Including like gay activity. And I'm not trying to imply anything about Cormac here, but just kind of trying to position us where he's at, right?
That's right on Bourbon Street. That is it.
Yeah.
It doesn't get more central to that whole thing.
Right. I mean, but Bourbon Street kind of built up out of it almost, I think. It's because it's old. I mean, it's been around since I think the 1700s, this bar. And if you go there now, I was there maybe a decade ago and they didn't use electric lights in the place. Like on purpose. It's all candlelight. It's pretty cool. It's a cool place. Anyway, at this place in New Orleans, he would apparently write on an overturned wooden packing crate that bore the slogan "World's Best" on it. I think that's funny. And he thought that was pretty funny too. And he's, living off almost no money packing crate, and it says "World's Best" on it.
Fellas, I gotta ask, is there a town in the United States that has more character than New Orleans?
No.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. It's a European city, or the closest thing that we have to a European city.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I
think
that's
Philadelphia is kind of in there too, surprisingly. But yeah, you're right. You are right. That is so, it's a very, very cool town. Got to shout out a friend of the pod, Sandbatch. Sandbatch, we see you in the chat. Mr. New Orleans himself.
That's right. Yeah, he knows about Lafitte's. I mean, you probably avoid it now if you live there. I'm sure. Just because
I have no idea.
It's like Times Square, New York.
Yeah,
you live in New York. You can go to Times Square.
Sure.
Yeah.
The trick with New Orleans is to go down for Halloween. You can avoid the Mardi Gras, but you kind of get a little festival kind of a thing. Yeah.
That makes sense. 1964. Cormac ate Thanksgiving at a Walgreens, and I'm only pointing this out because the same thing happens.
What do you mean he had his Thanksgiving dinner at a Walgreens?
Yeah, at a Walgreens, they'd have like, I don't know, it'd be super cheap, and you'd get like a turkey dinner,
Happened in Sutry too.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring it up. This happened in Sutry and Harrogate, and Sutry in that case kind of talks their way into it. He sort of charms this girl that's running the thing.
That's just like some weapons grade divorced dad energy,
right?
It's a high point. It's a high point in Sutry, right? It's like,
it is. They're like, oh my god, we get a hot meal. Yep,
we're gonna get a hot meal at Walgreens.
Yeah, it's incredible. Around this time, Thanksgiving of 1964, he wrote in his notes, quote, $7.97 in poke / prospects dim / writing equals happy. It's in this period too, sort of as Orchard Keeper is coming out or about to come out in development with Erskine and Random House, that McCarthy's starting to understand how he wants to be in terms of a public figure. I mean, now he famously has this sort of reclusive reputation, though his friends, if you were his buddy, he wasn't hard to get a hold of. He's just reclusive to New York Times and the Paris Review, right? But when he's starting out, there's kind of decisions to be made about how he wants to not only participate in the writing thing, but participate in the sort of the business enterprise and marketing and all of that of the writing life. The original writer bio that he sent along to Albert Erskine was kind of cheeky and self-consciously adopting the pose of a starving artist, talks about pool hustling and carousing at night and enlisting in the Air Force because he's broke. It's kind of honest, but like almost slightly exaggerating it, almost like trying to embrace this kind of low life sort of thing. But by the time Orchard Keeper actually comes out, it had been stripped down considerably. And, I think you can probably partially um, I think you can partially speculate on this and think, well, maybe he just doesn't want people knowing this, but I think it's worth considering how he may have felt about the fact that he had a son out there in the world. Um, he must have been conscious. There must have been moments where he felt like he'd abandoned his kid, right? Or if he'd have done something different, he could have been in the that had to have been circling around in his head. And apparently in Outer Dark, there are that theme is laid on even thicker than it already is. Apparently, early drafts indicate that. So I think there's probably somewhat of a desire to have a private life, but there also might be, what if my son reads eventually later on and finds out that when, you know, his mom was raising him by herself, I was in New Orleans partying. I don't want that to be what people think, right? Anyway, interesting. Um, Now 1965, kind of picking back up 1965, Orchard Keeper has come out. Didn't sell a million copies, as we said, but it did make McCarthy kind of an instant name in circles of people who know, right? He got plaudits from none other than Ralph Ellison, who said McCarthy, quote, is a writer to be read, to be admired, and quite honestly envied. And that was a blurb that would be used on editions of McCarthy books practically up till the end, actually. Um, he got $6,500, which in today's dollars is about 10 times that much, from the Academy of Arts and Sciences, largely thanks to, excuse me, John Hersey, of who wrote nothing, who the author of none other than Hiroshima. People may remember that book.
That's a very fine book, a very difficult read,
It
very
is.
traumatic to read.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting that this, we have this whole, the bomb, that whole narrative is in here. This guy's helping him get his career off the ground. But interestingly enough, at this time when he got this $6,500, McCarthy was also invited to join the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he declined. Um, I just thought that was kind of interesting. This is definitely where he's starting to find, you can call it his integrity. Is it a lack of integrity to join the Academy of Arts and Sciences? I don't personally think so, but apparently this is not something that Cormac wanted to spend his time or energy on. Um, Let me give a little bit about some details about sales here in the late 60s, just because I think this is interesting. So, I think this is from Diane C. Luce's Embracing Vocation. Quote, between 1965 and 1969, when a second printing was issued, The Orchard Keeper sold 3,926 copies. Since the publishing summary for the book prepared in 1964 had projected that the publisher would break even if 3,155 copies sold, this is his modest success for the publisher of a first novel. McCarthy was to receive $2,105 in royalties or advances, whichever was larger. So he ended up getting, in today's dollars, something like 20 grand. He had this, in today's dollars, something like $65,000 from the Academy of Arts and Sciences. That's a halfway decent chunk of change.
Sure. You're not gonna sneeze at it.
No, absolutely not. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this money from the Academy of Arts and Sciences allowed Cormac McCarthy in 1965 to travel to Europe. This is while he's about halfway done with the revisions of Outer Dark. He had found his way back to Knoxville before that and sort of decided that Knoxville was not conducive to productivity. He was not getting the kind of writing done that he wanted to. What was he up to? You imagine that he's hanging out with J-Bone still, and some of these guys who, the same type of people who were getting murdered by their girlfriend's boyfriend in their bed and that sort of thing, right? So anyway, he's off to Europe. Um, on the ocean liner Sylvania, it's a cruise ship. McCarthy was approached by the English dancer Anne Delisle. Anne Delisle was on board entertainment. Her and a friend of hers were a singing and dancing duo called the Healy Sisters. Anne Delisle and McCarthy bonded on the ship, and I want everybody to imagine Cormac McCarthy dancing on a cruise ship. I think that's a humorous image. um, he was on his way to Ireland. She continued on to Southampton, where she was from, but they kept in touch. He ends up accompanying her on her performance tours for a couple months out of Britain, and eventually ends up proposing to her in a guest house in 1965. They get married in 1966 at an Episcopal church in Hamble. No one from McCarthy's family attended. So he is now married this English dancer singer in England. They settle in Paris for a while at the Hotel Montjoly near the Moulin Rouge to finish up Outer Dark. So he's basically going to Moulin Rouge to write this intense, incestuous, biblical like horror story. Uh this hotel, as he describes it later in life in The Passenger, as quote favored by traveling entertainers, and any morning there would be jugglers and hypnotists and exotic dancers and trained dogs in the lobby coffee shop. Interesting. Early in 1966, he applies for a grant through Rockefeller's Imaginative Writing and Literary Scholarship Program. Now, there's something very interesting that I learned in just the last couple days that might tie into this whole earlier LSD thing. Apparently, very early on, or pre-1968, when the CIA was trying to figure out, when Sidney Gottlieb was trying to figure out what LSD was and whether there were any intelligence or military applications for it. Apparently, they dispersed the funding and LSD, a lot of it, through the Rockefeller Foundation. So, 1966, McCarthy gets a grant from the Rockefeller Imaginative Writing and Literary Scholarship Program. I don't know. I'm not saying anything happened there. It's just kind of interesting. McCarthy asks for $4,000, and I think they end up giving him $5,000. And Erskine noted, like, hey, they pretty much give you what you ask for up to a point. So when someone says, how much money do you need? Don't like lowball it. Tell them I need this much money. Right? Like other writers were getting like $7,500, $8,000. He asked for four and he got five. Let's see. One thing that's interesting, his application for the Rockefeller Center, he includes sample passages of Suttree, which is in development at the time. And he also writes a bit of an essay, in which he sets forth some of the aims of Suttree. And one of the things he says is he wants to present Knoxville as, quote, a living organism. The overall effect aims at not a total knowledge of life in this city, but at an understanding of what life here would mean to a person who was totally aware. I just think that's pretty cool.
James Joyce spoke in the same terms about Ulysses, by the way.
Exactly.
Same exact verbiage almost.
Yeah, exactly. And I got much more as I was reading it this last time. I saw the Ulysses in it a lot more than I had on a previous read. James Joyce is, we've talked about James Joyce, and including the three of us on this program. But James Joyce's performance, or whatever you want to call it, in Ulysses is a lot more wide-ranging in terms of stylistically. Like McCarthy's got a much more compared to, I'm not saying it's narrow, but compared to Joyce and Ulysses, it's a more narrow style, right? I'm doing this throughout, whereas James Joyce is like inventing a new genre every chapter. But nonetheless, it's definitely there. Let's see. McCarthy and Delisle's honeymoon consisted of them buying an old gold Jaguar XK120 convertible. I think you're supposed to say Jaguar, but I say Jaguar because I'm an American. apparently this car was pretty beat up and it had chickens roosting in it. Um, McCarthy fixed it up and they drove from Paris to Geneva across Italy and back along the southern coast of France to Barcelona. Have you guys ever seen a? Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
No, what an amazing trip. And in this
Yeah.
sucker, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah,
This
it's a great. I was going to tell you to look it up. It's a great
classic. Love it.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's a beautiful car.
Yeah.
From Barcelona, they took a car ferry to Ibiza in August of 1966, where McCarthy would more or less finish Outer Dark. Now they had a fairly interesting group of friends in Ibiza. Let's see if I can find this page here. Again, looking at embracing vocation. I mean, it's interesting that for Cormac McCarthy being such a distinctly American voice, not to say it's a surprise that he traveled. It's slightly a surprise that he lived for such an extended period in Europe to me. I, not that he shouldn't have or anything, but it doesn't strike me. You imagine before you dig into this stuff that Cormac just like lived in a shack and then, lived in an adobe, some abandoned adobe building. That's the kind of places that you picture him in. And here he is in Ibiza. Now, Ibiza then isn't quite what it is now. I think now it's a perpetual rave in Ibiza. I don't think that's what was going on in the 60s, but nonetheless.
Cormac wasn't out there with Zac Efron or something.
No, I don't think so. Doing ecstasy on the beach. I don't think there was a lot of that going on, but there was probably a lot of time hanging out on the beach. Oh man, I'm a little frustrated that my Kobo is not cooperating with me. So Aaron, I was gonna talk about that part that I shared with you about them being friends with the art forger.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I wish I could pull that up. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, you'll find it. No worries.
I think you sent you a text or something.
Interesting. Yeah, this is surprising to me. I did not expect that he would spend really any time in Europe, but at the same time, as an American and he's Catholic, you kind of want to go, Irish Catholic, you kind of want to go see the old country.
Yeah, and he first landed in Ireland. He first landed in Ireland.
Right. Yeah, that seems to make sense. And how fun too to buy this Jaguar. And they're famous for their reliability and they're very practical vehicles.
Right.
I may have owned a Jaguar X Type at one point. It was like, it's like a Taurus Plus,
Right.
It's like a Taurus for a sucker who wants to part with his money, I mean, it's not anything that special or fancy. Yeah. How are you doing, Brad? You finding it?
Good. I got this bit I want to read here.
All right,
so
good.
Quote, this is from Embracing Vocation. Quote, he and Anne stayed in Ibiza for a year instead of returning to the United States in fall of 1966, as he had earlier thought they would. There they met Philadelphia writer Leslie Garrett, whose first novel, The Beasts, had just won the Maxwell Perkins Award, and who would become a friend until his death in 1993. They also socialized with Clifford Irving and his fiancée Edith Sommer, who hosted them several times at their finca. Their electricity was unreliable, so they often baked potatoes in foil in the fireplace. Irving was then in the process of interviewing Hungarian artist / art forger Elmer D. Horry for the biography Fake: Adventures of the Greatest Art Forger of Our Time. And Anne recalls that she and Cormac met de Horry socially as well. She remembers that their circle of friends would meet for morning coffee. There was a lot of hanging out. Eventually, it generally almost every day, sometime in the mid-afternoon, degenerated into drinking. But I thought that this Elmer de Horry, one of the great art forgers of all time, and Cormac being friends was pretty interesting. Aaron, I think you thought that was interesting too. What is the significance of forgery in the work of Cormac McCarthy?
Well, particularly in Blood Meridian, there's the big question of what the judge is a judge of. When we finally get that answer, the kid is having surgery in San Diego and is lying in the delirium of ether, and the judge visits him. And in this dream, the judge is shadowing a cold forger, which is a counterfeiter who's like laboring over a coin that can pass, a fake that can pass as the true article. And that linked up with this idea of this famous forger in a really interesting way for me.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's, it does make you think, like, because an art forger who is talented enough is an artist, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
if you can paint a painting that nobody, that and pass it off as some great artist, that is a supreme talent. You might paint like, why am I not thinking of any painters' names at the moment? But you may paint a copy of a famous painter's painting, and that painter probably couldn't do that for a different painter, if that makes sense.
Right.
Right.
That's
Like,
right.
it's an incredible skill. And in some ways, you think about what you're trying to do as a fiction writer, you're trying to make something seem as though it actually happened. That's
Absolutely.
it's not forging in some kind of illicit sense, but it is sort of the same thing. You're trying to make something that you're trying to pull something out of the ether and make it real. Um, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall for these conversations between Cormac McCarthy and Elmer DeHory, and just,
Okay.
yeah, fascinating stuff. Now, um, Ibiza was a little bit too much, and Cormac eventually decides that, I think, and Delisle implies anyway, that the drinking and socializing had become too much, and he wanted to, focus on his writing. And Cormac did apparently try to tell his friend Leslie Garrett to get out of Ibiza. And Leslie Garrett apparently did. He wrote that one novel. I don't think he wrote another novel. He was considered a great talent, and he did sort of just degenerate into a variety of addictions. So we have Cormac kind of right on that edge, and he hasn't quit drinking entirely yet. That wouldn't happen for a few more years, but that certainly, here's $70,000 and a brand new hot wife and a Jaguar, and let's get a place on the beach in Ibiza, and then at the same time, let's try to get some serious writing done.
Yeah.
Like, this is not going to happen.
Not great.
So they go back to the United States. Apparently, she was excited about going to the United States. Where do they go? Why? Knoxville, of course. Now, I think this may have been, this would be 1967, October of 1967. He'd been in Europe for about 2 years, more than 2 years. I think after his return is the first time he meets Albert Erskine in person, actually. It had been all correspondence up till then, I'm pretty sure. And they, let's see, what do I talk about? Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I kind of lost my place here. Okay. 1968, uh, not Outer Dark, but Child of God comes out. Let's see. And one thing worth noting here is basically from Outer Dark from Orchard Keeper to Child of God, sales actually went down after each of them. So, after some amount of time that they had been published, sort of in the first edition, Orchard Keeper sold the most, Outer Dark sold a little bit less, and then my understanding is Child of God sold even a little less than that. So, despite the fact that he's getting Rockefeller grants, he's getting the William Faulkner Award, he's getting Academy of Arts and Sciences thing, the actual establishing a writer as a career as a writer who sells books, that's not really going in the right direction. Nonetheless, he is making a name amongst critics to some degree. A really important review came through a new personal friend of the writer, Guy Davenport, wrote a glowing review of Outer Dark for the New York Times. And Davenport is an interesting guy, extremely talented writer in his own right. And also he's a sort of another, I thought that this was pretty interesting when you find these living links between Cormac and, say, the modernists, the capital M modernists. Guy Davenport was a personal friend of Cormac McCarthy, Guy Davenport also visited Ezra Pound regularly at St. Elizabeth's. So, just kind of an interesting how the 6 degrees of separation, how these connections are all made.
Well, this is what we say in the pod is there are only 25,000, 50,000
Right.
people alive at any given time. The rest, it's just a simulation and we're some sort of, anyway. There you go.
Yeah.
It is very strange in this podcast. You find these little pockets and it's not that hard to connect one person. The more generous way to look at that would be we're all connected. We're all closer to each other than we think. That would be the nice way to put it. This show is called Art of Darkness, so we
right
lean the other way sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Now by the time a year or so after he gets back from Ibiza, the Rockefeller money has run out. He sells film rights for a fairly modest sum. Go ahead.
I just that is a champagne problem in a way.
Yeah.
Right, the Rockefeller money has run out.
Oh dear! Is there any Rockefeller money left? Yeah,
I seem to have spent all the money from the Rockefellers. A very nice problem to have.
Right.
However, you still have no money.
You still have no money. Yeah, you have to think there was a moment where his wife was like, "Well, certainly they have a lot of money. Maybe you could ask them for more."
Why are these Rockefellers so stingy?
Right.
How did they get to be so wealthy? It wasn't by giving degenerate writers. It was definitely not by supporting writers. I'll tell you that.
That's not how you make billions with a B.
No, or not how you keep them too. Unfortunately.
Yeah. That's so funny. Okay, so he does sell film rights. Ballantine buys mass market paperback rights to Outer Dark and Orchard Keeper for $7,500. Those print runs did not do particularly well. He applied for a Guggenheim, stating that it was to support his work on Suttree, which he had been working on for 6 years. And by 1969, he apparently had 1,800 draft pages. And of course, he got a Guggenheim. I struggled to find anything that Cormac tried to do in terms of getting a grant or whatever that didn't happen. There's not a lot of, he applied for this thing and tough luck, try again next year. That doesn't seem like that ever happened to him, but maybe I'm missing it. Okay. 1969 or so, settling in Tennessee with Ann Delisle. This time he wasn't quite as poor when he lived in Seaver County with Lee, but there still isn't a ton of cash. They apparently lived on I said they lived on a pig farm earlier. When he was with Lee, they lived in a mountain shack. This time they lived on a pig farm. Very different.
Wow. Rewind. Mountain shack.
Right.
Hitherto.
Right.
Now pig farm. This is very important because that is in literature and writing and drama, we talk about the progression of character.
Right.
So they've gone from the mountain shack
to
a pig farm.
Right. Correct.
You've got. I don't know if you guys have been on a pig farm, but it smells to high heaven, man.
It's not great. It's not a good smell. No, it'll turn you off eating bacon, frankly, for a little while.
It will for a while.
Yeah.
Then it feels like revenge. Then it feels like the smell of victory.
Right. Yeah. So
I like the way you think, Aaron Gwyn. I really do.
Now, in this pig farm, in Rockford, Tennessee, they lived on this pig farm for a little while. And then late 1969, Cormac, without consulting Delisle, bought a barn with 11 acres of land on Light Pink Road outside Louisville, Tennessee. You probably, if you did a careful Google street view of Light Pink Road, you could probably figure out exactly where this barn is. It's about a half an hour from Knoxville. Now, I am going to try to get this page to come up on my little device here. Hopefully I have some luck because this is a pretty good bit. First, have either of you guys spent time in Tennessee?
Mm-hmm. Some.
Yeah.
A little bit. I went to the Sewanee Writers Conference. Tennessee Williams left his estate to Sewanee. The University of the South, the Episcopalians have this beautiful campus. Aaron, you ever been down there? You've been to Sewanee?
I haven't. I bet it's gorgeous though.
It's incredible, unbelievable. That's another conference I speak highly of. If you can ever get in, go. It's a weird one because they have they let the playwrights in. We don't always they don't always want us. But
what are you guys catering, or what are you guys doing? I'm just teasing.
You got me. You got me. No, but it's, and the reason they do is because Tennessee left as a state, there, so they have this special connection, and they have Tennessee money, and they do scholarships and a fellowship where you can pay your way, and the campus is gorgeous. They sent their architects over to Oxford and Cambridge and basically said, "Hey, go take notes. We want that." Like,
wow.
So it's very unusual, very high ticket item campus, and one of these sort of hidden gems where you'll meet somebody who went to someone and you go, okay, you got something going on.
Right.
Yep.
Those places still exist for now. I hope that this is yeah, it's not so I think it goes without saying that McCarthy never went to Sewanee. And this is not why he was down there. Hold on, I'm still killing time. This bit I actually do really want to read.
No worries, you'll get it. You're gonna find it. The Life on the Pig Farm with Cormac.
Life on the Pig Farm, yeah. And you can imagine that, like, apparently Anne was kind of down for the adventure, right? She'd driven across Europe in a Jaguar. She wanted to come to Tennessee, but you have to imagine that she had a moment when they showed up at the pig farm. She kind of took a smell and was like, oh, I don't know about this.
From Ibiza to the pig farm, dude.
Right.
That's like that summer. I spent that summer over in Switzerland, and the first thing I did was I came back to Minnesota. I was dating a Canadian. This is in college. I was dating a Canadian gal. She really wanted to go to the state fair. So I went from a summer in Switzerland, and I was broke, just on my ass broke. But I was in Switzerland, and I had a host over there, and I was whatever I'm going around France and da da da. So that right back to Minnesota, totally jet lagged. Next day, Minnesota State Fair.
Okay, that's whiplash, dude. Talk
about life on a stick.
Yeah. That's cultural whiplash.
You reckon that Anne hadn't seen much of America, and so like when she comes home with Cormac and they go to the pig farm, she just thinks like, oh, this is what America is. It's a nation of pig farmers.
Right. This is there's Hollywood, there's New York, and I guess there's the rest of it.
There's the pig farm.
Yeah.
And we're on the pig farm.
Right. I've got this bit here. So this is not the pig farm, but they bought this barn on 11 acres. Quote, this is from Embracing Vocation by Diane C. Luce. Quote, when they bought it, the structure was just a cinder block shell on a concrete slab, McCarthy told Mark Owen. He repaired its broken casement windows and they moved in, converting it to a home as they lived in it. This was time-consuming work, which McCarthy did himself with the help of Anne and sometimes friends. McCarthy's design for his life allowed for interruption to his writing, and he enjoyed working with his hands. Quote, I've always been interested in architectural design, and it gives me something to do in my spare time. Delisle reports that he was in charge of everything, and the house was entirely of his design. Among other projects, McCarthy built stone chimneys and added a stone room to the structure. Delisle recalls that they would be dressed up and driving somewhere, and Cormac would stop the car to pick up stones that he could use. She remembers that he recovered a 6x4-foot slab weighing about 1,000 pounds that had slid down the mountain near Chilhowee Lake and transported it to their property on a septic tank truck. Then, with the help of friends, he winched it up onto a wheeled contraption of his own devising and jockeyed it into place in the wide livestock door frame at the end of the barn. With a magnificent hearthstone laid, he constructed the stone fireplace and wall around it. The symbolism of this act was certainly not lost on him, even though the hearth fire of their marriage would eventually die out. The couple liked to refinish furniture together, and one piece was McCarthy's big writing desk, which they had found in an old rag shop in Knoxville. It sat under a tarp at their house for some time until McCarthy decided to refinish it. When he removed the drawers and turned the desk upside down, a rain of silver dollars tumbled out, a welcome windfall. He cleaned the piece and applied 7 layers of French polish. Yeah, right. And, a 50-cent piece then, it was like $5 now. like, it's about it's roughly times 10. So one thing I missed this earlier. So we did talk about when he was a boy, one of the things he and his brother would do was like build little structures out of stone. When he was living in in the shack, the mountain shack in Sevier County, and with Lee, he also built a stone chimney and maybe some other stone structures from leftover stones from the house of James, the great writer James Agee. And then we have him here again, really focused on putting these stones together. And he would say at one point that like stacking stones is actually the oldest occupation. I mean, it's older than anything. It's older than prostitution, he says. And then he says, I think something interesting about the modern age is with the advent of Portland cement and reinforced concrete, nobody stacks stones anymore. And the implication is something is being lost there. He's not sure exactly what necessarily. His play, The Stonemason, kind of brushes up against these themes. I just think it's an interesting thing because similarly in this same time frame, the late 60s, early 70s, he helps a friend, Bill Kidwell, construct a stone mosaic on the sidewalks of Maryville, Tennessee's Main Street. So this is a preoccupation of his, just stacking stones and trying to fit things together and finding the right stones. I just think I might start doing this. I might try it anyway. See if I can get any zhuzh out of it. I'm not sure. Now eventually this does, as the money kind of starts to run out, even though they're getting this grant money and stuff. This is another period of poverty, and Cormac is, one of the most noteworthy things about his later interview with Oprah is the sort of stories of poverty, and Oprah being sort of perplexed by his and sort of admiring it at the same time, his attitude of like sort of never going for the money, right? And it became a meme just recently about Anne begging him to take advantage of this like $2,000 opportunity to go talk at a college, and him saying, everything I have to say is in the books, and rejecting it. And meanwhile, they eat beans another night and they're bathing in the lake because they literally live in a barn that hasn't been finished yet. It's interesting. He says one point, he kind of believed in providence in this regard, though. He says at one point in the Oprah interview that he ran out of, I don't think this was at this time. I'm not sure what time in his life it was, but he says something about having run out of toothpaste. And that same day going down to the mail, and there's a sample of toothpaste sent from Colgate or whatever, right? And just he said weird things would happen for him like that. Things like the silver dollars in the desk. Why is there an entire drawer full of silver dollars? Who leaves that behind, right? So things continually kind of worked out. Delisle starts making a little bit of money as the 70s wore on. She had a school teaching dance and was in a Louisville dance company. She says that they never discussed money, her and Cormac, and that he, quote, always provided for them. But you kind of have to imagine even he's a little anxious about the lack of funds coming from the writing, right? Especially Cormac was a guy with no plan B. This is what I found so interesting about this biography. And you see this with a lot of artists, but I don't know if anybody ever had less of a plan B than Cormac McCarthy. There's just nothing else.
Yeah. This is the way, I have to say, and this is absolutely no shade to Cormac, of course, but this is the way people think who come from money.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, actually.
I mean, he told Oprah that he said, he said it might have been naive, but I always had the belief that I would be taken care of.
Right.
And I think if you grow up without, anxiety about where the money's going to come from, that maybe you carry that over until you're disabused of it.
Oh, right. I don't think you ever get it out of it. I don't think it ever changes. You can never if you grow up in and or around poverty, it stays with you forever.
Yes.
Yeah,
100%. My grandparents were both Depression era kids. My grandmother, her parents were literally sharecroppers and Pentecostal preachers, and they both would hoard, like, people keep like boxes, TVs come in because they think, oh, well, I'll be able to use the box. They kept the styrofoam that came inside the TV boxes. So things of no value, they hoarded because they knew what it was like to come from real privation.
Right. It's like, this thing is free. You can't just throw it away.
Right. Yeah. We may need that styrofoam. And I would always say, for what?
Right. You're both kind of right, though, in a way.
And in a more general and I think possibly relatable way to people who are a little bit younger, our generation, I think Mr. Gwyn, Professor Gwyn, I think you're a little older than us, but I think, you once you felt it, it affects your relationship to money and finances your entire life. I don't think you ever, you can.
For sure.
So there you are.
Yeah.
So people know.
Yeah. Now, on this money front, at some point in, I think, 1971, McCarthy, it's just kind of funny. He undertakes a scheme with his friend Gary Goodman to sell some of his books himself. Cormac McCarthy.
Sorry, what? Gary Goodman?
Gary
Goodman, right out of Central Casting.
Right. Yeah. He's a good man.
Right. Perfect.
Apparently Cormac McCarthy had been somewhat dismayed to find out that his books weren't in a lot of bookstores. People would write him letters or whatever. He would find out, my book isn't in that bookstore. I don't think it's a surprise. I mean, he sold 3,000 copies. I don't think it would be a surprise to not see his book in a bookstore, but he thought this was a problem. He'd written some sort of snippy letters to Albert Erskine, who, by the way, had basically done everything humanly possible to get Cormac McCarthy's career off the ground, or everything within his talents and network to get. I mean, Albert Erskine was basically acting as his agent because Cormac for a long time didn't have an agent. Probably wasn't even clear on what an agent was, at least in the early parts of things. But anyway, 1971, they kind of start up this scheme that they're gonna sell books through an organization they started called Owl Books. Had a PO box in Knoxville. Cormac would sign them apparently, and they would sell these. Apparently, they made a few $100s this way, which ended up not sort of being worth the effort, I suppose. There were attempts to sell McCarthy's work in the 70s to Playboy, but this proved unsuccessful. And in general, especially earlier in McCarthy's career, they had a very, very, very difficult time placing excerpts of this stuff in any of the magazines or journals. And it's not because the editors didn't like it. It was usually one of a handful of reasons. It was a little too dark for the publication. Sometimes it was difficult to find a scene or a chapter that people thought could stand by itself without the rest of the book. And then the other thing is Cormac didn't have any short material. He didn't have a short story. You didn't crank out a couple short stories every year. That just wasn't part of his mode. Yeah.
You know what I'm going to do here is open this up because we have a friend in the chat who asked this very question. And this is our buddy in the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. And I'll throw this to both you and Aaron, Brad. Nervous Norvisk asks, only 3 short stories? Elaborate.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron, do you know why he didn't write any short stories, or why he said he didn't?
I think it's, gosh, I mean, some novelists don't, right?
Yeah.
I think, I do both and have done both. When I sold my first book, my agent sold a novel with it that I hadn't written. I just wrote a first chapter and he sold a completed collection. And then I thought,
Nice.
Well, I've written these stories. How different can a novel be? Oh
Right.
boy, was I wrong, right? It's a different muscle, right? And some people can effectively do both very well. I mean, Philip Roth could do it. Dennis Johnson could do it, but some writers are pure novelists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he said at one point, Cormac McCarthy said, anything that doesn't take years off your life and drive you to suicide hardly seems worth doing.
There you go.
I
Not
think it
enough
also,
suicide.
yeah, I think it relates to like um he sort of famously disliked a lot of well-known writers, people like Proust, because he didn't think that they dealt with life and death. I think in part the short story lacked the intensity of whatever McCarthy was going for. The short story didn't get him to that point. It
It's the
wasn't
wrong
engaging enough.
vehicle. It's the
It's not
wrong
good.
vehicle.
Yeah. I write short stories, and I write novels too, and it's two totally different things. I mean, it's a novel does, like, you're a different person from the beginning of it to the end of it. It's not it's like
Right.
a section of your life, or a short story is doesn't have that quality to it. And so he just, I guess, never felt like it was sort of worth it, or found subjects engaging enough. But it did make him difficult to market, because you didn't have anything to stick in a magazine when every 6 months, to kind of keep the literary reputation alive and build it from one to the next.
Man, that
Um,
was really those were the last days of writers who could make reputations off short stories,
right, right.
right? I think we talked about this before on the
Mhm.
Faulkner episode, but like Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway didn't really want for money once he achieves such celebrity. But these people supported their novels by writing short stories and
Right,
selling them to Saturday Evening Post or Collier's or Scribner's magazine back then.
right.
And by the time in the 70s, short stories made less money. But Barry Hannah, some of these guys of that era, and some of the guys who became big Iowa workshop guys were like known for particular short stories.
Hmm. Yeah,
So not the
yeah,
case
yeah.
anymore.
No, no, it really isn't. It's like a ancillary thing to the yeah,
Right.
it's changing all the time, and I think it's probably changed even more so with the internet, and journals are predominantly online now. Yeah. And it's interesting with the rise of, there's a way that one could look at the rise of the internet and the rise of ebooks as like a short story renaissance, that somehow like short stories are kind of thrust to the fore of cultural relevance. And for whatever reason, that just didn't happen. I don't know why exactly, but it's still the novel, it's still the thing. Um, yeah. Um, Now, in the 70s, there were a few other things,
I'll
approaches. Go ahead.
volunteer. I'm going to volunteer something.
Yeah.
America is fundamentally a culture of cinema,
Hmm.
still now,
Yeah.
and TV and film. And
Yeah.
I think that the film structure, and now even and especially television structure, mimics the structure of the novel much more closely than it does the short story.
Mm. There's some truth to that for sure. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that that's maybe part of it.
And we know Cormac was perfectly, I mean, he tried a number and succeeded a number of times to write screenplays, to write for film, right?
And of course,
Um,
famously, No Country began as a screenplay.
Right, right, right. And he also wrote The Counselor, and he wrote one called Of Whales and Men, that we'll
Mhm.
talk about a little bit later. That was never produced, still sitting in a drawer at Texas State at the moment. Um,
Whales and men in this economy?
yeah, right. It was the 80s. There was a lot of money floating around,
Things
a
were
lot of
really,
cocaine
yeah,
going
sure,
on.
sure,
Yeah,
sure,
yeah, it
sure.
was a
Very
different
good,
time.
very good.
Yeah.
Now, now it's just cocaine floating around and no money.
No money, and not as many whales either. So,
Sure.
um, now in the 70s, McCarthy starts looking for an agent. He somehow gets hip to the idea that he might need a literary agent. He gets one for a little while. We're going to talk about his second agent, which was a much better deal for him. Um, that comes a little bit later. He was haggling some new deals, some reprint deals. He sold film rights to Stacy Keach, with whom he was friends. I just thought that was an interesting note. Never got produced. Um, uh, And then in 1974, this happens. This is from Embracing Vocation. Quote, on Anne Delisle's birthday, January 31st, 1974, McCarthy took his wife of almost 8 years out to dinner at the Orangery, an upscale restaurant in Knoxville, and moved west without her the next day. Took her out to dinner for her birthday and then left her behind the next day. He had been packing up his belongings all month. Sometime before he left, McCarthy inscribed a copy of Outer Dark to Anne, naming her, quote, the love of my life, but apologizing that he could not offer her all that she deserved. Anne was uncertain whether her marriage would survive the stresses it had been and still was under. But at Cormac's invitation in mid-August, she joined him in Tucson, where they lived together in his apartment for 2 weeks before making an extended trip that fall, driving in McCarthy's outfitted Volkswagen bus to El Paso, Chihuahua, Babacora, Casas Grandes, Guerrero, Llanos, and back to El Paso. After resting there a few days, they made another excursion by train across the Sierra Madre and the Copper Canyon to Los Mochis and Topolobampo, then by boat to the Baja Peninsula, La Paz, and south to Cabo San Lucas. Except for her anxiety about their future, to Anne, the trips seemed much like their travel across Western Europe in the first months of their marriage, exciting adventures filled with new people, places, and food. McCarthy was not writing on their excursions in Mexico, but he was absorbing the culture and landscapes of the borderlands that would inform 5 of his 8 subsequent novels and his screenplay, The Counselor. When his money ran out, the couple returned to El Paso in mid-October, where Cormac put Anne on a plane back to Tennessee, telling her that he might see her at Christmas. He did return at intervals, and he would send batches of revised pages of Suttree for her to type and return to some, quote, some strange clandestine address. However, their marriage was never secure again. McCarthy started his writing career in 1959 full of youthful confidence that he could write well and possessed of the maturity and discipline to work steadily at his novels, even though he was making little money from his writing. And in 1974, he makes like another move. Like, this is something you see in his life. Something about the writing isn't working, and he decides that what will change things is a move of some kind, a move across the country, a move to Europe, go to Europe, whatever, go to Alaska, maybe, right? There's something about things aren't working out. I need to bail, and hopefully kind of start over when I get to that place. So where does he do? This is what we could call the El Paso years, starting in 1974. What's he doing in El Paso? Well, he's finishing Suttree, and because he always needed to have 2 books in the chamber, he probably started to write Blood Meridian. This is one thing about Cormac. He, most of the time throughout his career, would have 2 projects going somewhat simultaneously. Suttree was developed over the course of maybe up to 20 years. Blood Meridian for probably, and it's, for a writer, the beginnings of these things are kind of foggy. Like, do you say he started working on it the first time he wrote a sentence that worked its way in some version into the book, or do you, when do you consider a project started? But for McCarthy, it was having 2 or more books going simultaneously.
And there are pages in the Blood Meridian boxes at San Marcos that are labeled 1973. By the way.
Wow, I did not know that. That's very interesting. So that's before he was still living in Tennessee then.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Interesting. So that's probably part of the reason that he moved. There is a suggestion that even the reason that he moved to Chicago in 1960 was to have access to certain newspaper archives related to a murder that he wanted to write about in Child of God. So it's possibly he's moving these places for research purposes primarily. Actually, I wouldn't even say possible. It seems like that's actually the case. Now these years in El Paso are another period. It's pretty lean. He's living largely alone at first. It's not like he's got a bunch of buddies out there. And I think of this as kind of like a purgatory that he put himself in. Not hell, but like a literary waiting room to see if he would be sort of punished for his sins or rewarded for his faith. That's what I think about this El Paso period. Let me take a quote from no, I think we'll move on past that. But let's talk about something else that starts going on in the 70s, because I think this is an interesting sidetrack and it could have led to an entirely other career, or an entirely different looking career than the one Cormac ended up with. He was asked by the filmmaker Richard Pierce, better known for directing episodes of Party of Five and CS Miami, to contribute a screenplay to a PBS television film anthology called Visions. This installment was titled The Gardener's Son. It starred Brad Dourif as who was what's his name in the Wise Blood film adaptation. Why am I blanking on his name? Hazel Motes.
Say it again, Aaron.
Enoch Emery.
No, Hazel Motes. Yeah, you got it. You got it, Aaron. Yeah. Good movie, by the way. Worth watching.
Yeah. So this is The Gardener's Son. Brad Dourif is a disgruntled amputee in an 1876 South Carolina company town. He murders a member of the wealthy Gregg family. And apparently McCarthy was very involved, not just in the writing and the research, but was on set for the duration of the shooting. And I thought this was a little interesting passage, just because it gives us an insight into his personality. This is McCarthy on the set of The Gardener's Son. This is just from Wikipedia, but it's interesting nonetheless. Quote, McCarthy was present on set for the duration of shooting and became involved with many facets of production. Pierce estimated that he and McCarthy met with more than 1,000 people throughout the process. McCarthy endeared himself to the cast and crew with his humorous, impromptu storytelling. Dourif recalled the author's fascinated appreciation for the particularities of local dialect. Quote, I guess there's something about the way characters use language. You know, Dickens always defined his characters so well with language. And I'm just remembering what a kick it was. We were out looking at locations and this old guy was showing us around and he'd say, well, you know, the other day, went over, got in my car, so to speak, turned on the engine, so to speak. And I remember McCarthy's delight at this dialect. He was describing it to somebody saying, quote, my God, this guy was talking about things that had really happened, but he'd always say, so to speak, as if it were a metaphor, as if it didn't happen. There it is. There's the writer. How the way this guy used the language was telling you so much about him. So easy to do, so easy to write, but so clear. However, McCarthy did not much enjoy making The Gardener's Son. While the experience satisfied his curiosity to observe and participate in filmmaking up close, its difficulties clarified his preference for the writer's life. It's back-breaking work, McCarthy told the local Knoxville newspaper. On location for 30 days, and last week we were working 16 to 18 hours a day. You got to be some kind of weirdo to think that's fun. Weirdo has a new connotation, by the way. This was quoted.
I've gotten the memo.
yeah. This is back in the 70s, so it still meant what it means. What it's supposed to mean. But it sure kept my interest up, and writers are basically pretty lazy people. More than 3 decades later, McCarthy had similar recollections for the Wall Street Journal. Quote, Dick Pierce and I made a film in North Carolina about 30 years ago, and I thought, this is just hell. Who would do this? Instead, I get up and have a cup of coffee and wander around and read a little bit, sit down and type a few words and look out the window. The novelist's life is easier than the film director's life. I'm sure that's the case.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, what else is going on throughout the 1970s? Well, he dates at least one younger woman, and there are often rumors in the back half of Cormac's life about him dating much younger women. We're going to talk about his third wife eventually. Around 1976 in El Paso is when he quits drinking completely, along with a young woman that he was dating. His first house in El Paso apparently was a stone cottage, wink, wink, behind a shopping center. He ate off a hot plate, cut his own hair, right? He's living a very, very lean life. In addition to writing, he was playing a lot of billiards and sort of slowly accumulating friends. Apparently, during this time, McCarthy, as he's like developing something of a social circle, apparently people would know him for a while before they found out that he was a writer. Like he was just this interesting kind of friendly, pretty good at pool guy. that would hang around, and you'd get to know him, and he could tell a good story. And so you were down for him, and he was from Tennessee. So it was interesting to maybe talk about the differences, whatever. And then, you might know him for 6 months and you're like, wait, Cormac wrote a novel? I didn't know that. What's it about? I think that's interesting that he's, not pushing it out there. Now, and I think it also tells you how little interest he had in being part of any kind of scene in terms of a literary scene. That was not really his bag. Now,
very interesting. What this tells me though is that this isn't a LARP with the swells, with the fancy people. The magazines and the newspapers, right? If he's also doing this with his like day-to-day friends and people he meets, he just really doesn't like talking about it.
Right.
Yeah. Very interesting. Maybe, and I know that some writers dread this too. They dread telling the story of something because Hemingway talked about this. What do they always ask? What are you working on?
Right.
What are you working on? Well, now you have to tell them the story. Well, and that can mess up people's processes. Yeah. Interesting.
I will tell you that I am highly reluctant to mention that I write to, if it's somebody that I'm only going to, I'm pretty confident that I'm only going to know them very briefly. Do you know what I mean? Like somebody you're running into and you may never see them again. Those people I usually won't, just because I don't want to get into it.
It's the same with podcasting. I never tell anybody I podcast ever. It's terrible.
Right. But it's interesting because there's one hand like, do you want to talk about it? And the other hand, you have to wonder, Cormac at this point, he's gotten all these like awards and grants and things, and he knows he's good, but like, somebody's going to say, well, have you written anything I might have read? And it's got to be like, yeah, if you were paying attention, if you cared, I did.
Are you familiar with the Faulkner Award for, you get into these weird conversations. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Right. And then you got to like brag just to like, it becomes complicated.
It's like, you're not Grisham. You're not Stephen King,
Right. Have you read anything I've written? You've read 3 books in the last decade. So no.
And all of them were purchased at an airport during a delay.
Right.
At least they're reading.
Yeah. But here's the other thing. So as on that note, you do have to kind of wonder if it's like, I wonder in this El Paso period before Blood Meridian, Suttrie's not quite done yet, right? The Border Trilogy is way off in the distance. You kind of wonder if he ever sort of laid awake at night and was like, I am a failure. I don't know that the poverty bothered him, but I think I don't know that he cared about the poverty, and I don't even know if he wanted the status. I think he wanted to be like as good as you could possibly be at this art form. I think it almost has to be in there for a guy to write this kind of stuff. And you kind of wonder if it was sort of the fact that he hadn't done it yet and he's now well into his 40s, if it wasn't a little embarrassing. I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah, he brings or brought a Kubrick level intensity to his work. It just radiates off the page. Nothing is out of place. No sentence has not been considered.
Right.
Deeply.
Right. Yeah.
There's a sense of, especially in his mature work, which is what I know most of, is nothing is wasted.
Yeah.
And
even when the style is like soaked into like, because he ranges in how what would be when you get into The Passenger, it's sentence to sentence, it's fairly conventional, though there are some absolutely bravura moments. And then you get Blood Meridian, it's highly stylized. But even then, it's still economical, in my opinion. I don't know. Now in the one thing does happen here, 1981 in this El Paso period. McCarthy, through his network, gets a MacArthur grant. This is the first year that they were offered. This is the so-called Genius Grant given to 20 to 30 individuals every year working in any field who have shown, quote, extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits and a marked capacity for self-direction.
I guarantee they've not given this to a podcaster yet. That is a massive oversight that needs to be corrected. I am calling it Come Town. Oh, I'm sorry. The Adam Friedland Show. We need to start petitioning. I actually, we did forget to ask the opening question, Brad. By the way,
we did.
We would normally ask me what I know about Cormac, but that's fine because we've already covered him, and and we're already well into it. But I will, in lieu of that, I will say at this point, if I'm not mistaken, and you probably have it in your notes, but I believe a letter was written at some point from somebody on the committee, or somebody was asked to give a recommendation, and they said something to the effect of this is someone who would honor the committee by accepting the award. Yes. So go on. Very interesting.
I did come across that, and I'm blanking on who that actually was now. But yes, that was something that was said. He would honor this as much as you'd be honoring him. It's a bunch of money. I think it was $500,000 to start with. Though there's an article in Vanity Fair that says it was $236,000. Nonetheless, a guy who is cutting his own hair to save a few dollars, suddenly getting $236,000. That's kind of a big deal. And that it would be like $800,000 now, the inflation, with inflation. And it's with this money that Cormac would write Blood Meridian. So, interestingly enough, McCarthy won the fellowship in the very first year of it, along with a couple people whose names we may know: Stephen Jay Gould, Stephen Wolfram, Robert Penn Warren, Leslie Marmon Silko, Derek Walcott, Elaine Pagels, and others. Those are sort of as I was scrolling, those are the names that jumped out at me the most. This would also plug McCarthy into a social network different than any that he had been in before. Apparently in the 80s and 90s, the MacArthur Fellows would have these meetups, and McCarthy actually went to the first one. Later on, he says he went to the first one because he was told there'd be physicists there. And but interestingly enough, he describes it like, we all know the MacArthur grant, right?
No, I'm thinking about Cormac in that meme where it's the guy at the party. They don't know I'm here for the physicists.
Right.
Yes, we do. You won't shut up about it.
Yeah, you won't shut up about physics. Yeah, this guy won't shut up about physics. It's awesome. But it's kind of interesting. Like, we all know the MacArthur grant, right? If Kevin, if I texted you to next year and was like, "Hey, did you know that Gwyn got a MacArthur grant?" You would know exactly. You'd be like, "Holy shit!" It'd be like crazy.
Yes, right? Give Gwyn the MacArthur grant. Absolutely.
And he's already overdosed on fentanyl.
Right. He's all right.
Immediately.
He didn't even finish reading the text. Yeah.
He just right out bought fentanyl OD.
Right.
By the way, they gave this to Walter Abish in one lump sum, and he never wrote another word.
Whoa.
Yeah. And then they started portioning it out.
Oh, yeah. Probably a good idea. Yeah. They did say in the mission statement, it does say that one of the things is that they have to have a marked capacity for self-direction, which is important. It's not maybe the most important thing for an artist or a writer, but it's pretty damn important that they be able to like self-motivate to do the thing, right?
You don't want to give it.
You
want to give it to somebody, and they're like, "Okay, that's good. I just wanted a MacArthur.
Right.
Thanks.
I'm done.
Thanks for the free cash. Where's the fentanyl?"
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting when McCarthy gets it, nobody knows what the MacArthur is. Basically, it's like a bunch of money, and they want me to come to a party. All right, I guess. And the limousine picks them up, and nobody really knows what it is even. Like, why are they giving us all this money? And like, what's the catch? Like, none of it's very clear. He describes it. He says it was like a television program. I like that. Like a TV show. It was like being on TV. And as I said, the reason he really went or what he claims was because there were physicists there. And one of these people that he met there apparently was Murray Gell-Mann, who is basically the guy who discovered the quark, and named the quark after knowing of the word being used in, is it Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake? Finnegan's Wake. Right. And Cormac McCarthy and Murray Gell-Mann hit it off, and this relationship comes into play later in the story. But just know that now Cormac is in a new, kind of different social strata. He's among intellectuals, like in different ones. Before it was pretty much Alan Erskine and Albert Erskine and a few other friends who Guy Davenport, who he could probably talk to, and then he had his old pool hall buddies, right?
Now it's like the meme, like Cormac McCarthy, the pool hustler,
right? Right, yeah, exactly. I didn't know they gave MacArthur grants for pool hustling. That's weird. Yeah. Yeah. You have to wonder too, you got to think too, what did his dad think the moment he got this MacArthur grant, right? Like, there has to be, you have to be kind of proud, but then you also have to feel a little bad that you doubted the whole thing, right? Like,
right.
You got to be
dad
like,
was like, I too was in the CIA.
Right. 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 Now in he's still living in El Paso. So this isn't, he's got some correspondences with some of the MacArthur people, but he's still in El Paso, and he's probably the only MacArthur fellow in El Paso at the time. Well,
I would imagine.
Yeah. Now in El Paso, he does develop a kind of a tight-knit group of friends, and I'll give you a couple of them because I think this will help you understand the sorts of people he's gravitates to. One is the writer Rick D. Marinas. Another is the lawyer Bobby Perrell, who received his McCarthy's mail for years. There was the noted clothing industry heir Jim Farah, the sculptor James Drake, and then a variety of local book dealers. He was not a recluse by any means. And apparently, a lot of people knew who he was, where he was. They knew what house he lived in. It wasn't, and this grew over time, right? As we get into all, through Blood Meridian, and especially into all the Pretty Horses phase of things. Because this stretch in El Paso is from the mid 1970s to, I think, 1999 or 2000, right? So his presence as a El Paso figure grows over time. And yet he never granted an interview to the local paper. One of the sort of a in memoriam written by an El Paso paper after he died mentions the fact that he never did anything for the community of El Paso. It mentions that twice. It's like they had to make sure you realize he did nothing for this town. He would not show up to local book events. The El Paso paper held like an event in his honor, a dinner in his honor sometime in the 90s, and he did not show up, and he told them he wasn't going to show up. Even into the 1990s, you could find him, eating in a Mexican restaurant or at Luby's with some weird book. And the sort of reputation he had was, if you went up to him to say hello, he would be very polite to you, or he would smile, and he probably wouldn't say anything, and he certainly was not going to ask you to sit down. He was just sort of waiting for you to leave him alone. I think it's kind of interesting. He's becoming sort of slowly locally famous. And there's another friend that he makes. Well, we talked about Suttree. Is there anything we can say about Blood Meridian? Obviously there is, but I don't want to go too deep into it. I'm assuming that the people who are listening to that's probably the book most people have read, I would say, is Blood Meridian.
Right.
What, maybe this is a question. What is the cultural significance of Blood Meridian?
Gosh, it's steeped into every area of media now. I mean, like video games, right? Like Red Dead Redemption exists because of it. People who have never read it have felt its influence. right? When, gosh, what was it in 2008 or nine or something like that? When editors and agents were asked to name the most important novels published. They picked Underworld, Blood Meridian, and Beloved.
Yeah, those are some bangers.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's funny that the last episode that Kevin and I recorded the conversation with our friend David Leo Rice, and we got to talking about an article that was going around about men not reading fiction, and I was like, well, we read Blood Meridian. I don't.
Yeah,
that counts, right?
Well, here's a good way of covering Blood Meridian very quickly. My friend Tommy Franklin, he was best friends with the writer William Gay, and I think he was the manager or is the manager of Gay's estate. And when Gay lived in Tennessee, he was pen pals with Cormac in the 70s. And so Gay had manuscripts of his that Cormac had edited, and kind of made some comments on and everything. And Gay had a number of letters from Cormac. And the last letter he got was from El Paso. And Cormac wrote, Gay had asked him what he's working on. And Cormac wrote, I'm writing about these old boys that go south of the border. And it just keeps getting darker and darker. I think that's Blood Meridian in a nutshell. Some old boys go south of the border. It keeps getting darker and darker.
I love that he can this is one of my favorite things about Cormac McCarthy as a personality, is this sort of laconic ability to describe Blood Meridian in that way. And then you dig into it and it's like, this is like one of the most, it's not only like an incredibly engaging read, but like on a like symbolic level, or whatever you want to call this, a scholarship level, the amount of research that would needed to be done, the amount of sort of hidden layers. It's also one of the most sophisticated things you can read. I mean,
for sure.
Right. It's not just a vibe. It's not just a vibe. It's not just like a fun story about, or a dark story or a violent story. There's so much going on in it.
No doubt.
And you're on a first read, you're missing like 90% of it, probably, even a close reader. And even if you're enjoying it, even if you finish and you're like, that's a hell of a good book, you probably missed almost everything that was going on.